Today on the 01581, special guest from out of town, way far away from Boston, Massachusetts, Doug Howgate from the Massachusetts Taxpayer Foundation. This is a show you won't want to miss. Hi, and welcome back. I'm joined today by my guest, Doug Howgate. Doug, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, Shelby.
So excited to have you on. I had the privilege of hearing you at a presentation earlier this year and found the information really, really interesting. And throughout your presentation, I thought, my viewers in Westborough would love to hear this and definitely wanted to share the information that you were providing. So before we get into the content, I know you've got a robust slideshow to share with us and talk through a little bit about yourself, please.
Sure. So Doug Howgate, I'm the president of the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation, and I spent a lot of my career working in and around the State House on the state budget and a number of public policy issues. And Mass Taxpayers, where I work now, is essentially a think tank that looks at issues that affect the state's long-term economic future. So that means the state budget, transportation policy, tax policy, but it also means demographics, right? And how the trends in population and labor force look to impact the Commonwealth in the years to come.
Okay, very interesting. And so does the foundation sort of advise the executive branch, legislators? How does your organization work with sort of those that we think of that set policy and set taxes?
Sure. So yes, we work with people on Beacon Hill, people off Beacon Hill. In fact, just on December 4th, we testified at the annual consensus revenue hearing, which is kind of how the state budget process kicks off, where we and some other economists project tax collections for the next couple of fiscal years. So that's a more formal way we interact with the process. But we also write a lot of reports, do a lot of briefings, presentations, try to do a lot of engagement with members, but the public more broadly, to understand the issues that are facing the Commonwealth and kind of make recommendations to hopefully put us on a strong footing.
Okay, great. All right, Doug, I know you have lots of information to share, so let's get right into it. And I'm going to hold my questions until sort of the end, unless
Sure.
there's something that's just I can't hold off on.
Absolutely. So yeah, I want to be mindful of time, so I may go through this relatively quickly. So I'm going to give a little bit of a fiscal update for the Commonwealth, where things are at, and then we want to talk a little bit about this demographic snapshot, both for the Commonwealth, but then we're going to look at Westborough as well as some surrounding communities. And we picked Northborough, Franklin, but then we also wanted to pick a couple kind of regional economic centers. So we got Framingham and Worcester in there as well. And we'll kind of do some quick hits, right? So just population, we'll look at labor force, housing, municipal finance, and then education.
Great.
So just in terms of the state finances, there's kind of a couple things to know. So leading out of the pandemic, the state, along with many other states, experienced this absolute explosion in tax collections, where the taxes the state collected grew by 40% or $10 billion in a 2-year period. Absolutely unprecedented. And that's great, right? Windfall revenues are good, but we always knew that we were likely to then see those revenues decline, at least temporarily, right? What goes up to some extent must come down. And so what this slide shows you is what tax collections look like in fiscal year 2023. So that's the tax year that ended this past June 30th. And what this shows you is the budget was based on the idea that taxes would fall by $1.5 billion in that fiscal year, which in normal times would be catastrophic. You're talking your budget cuts, you're talking layoffs, all that stuff. But because we had seen such a growth in tax collections over time, we were able to kind of withstand that decline and still have a pretty significant increase in spending. Now, in fact, what we did see was tax revenues just didn't fall by $1.5 billion. They fell by $2 billion. And so the real question for budget makers when we testified a few days ago, as well as people put together the fiscal year 24 budget is, do we need to panic, right? As we're looking at a $2 billion decline in revenues, what do we do about it? And our organization has been in the camp of we need to be vigilant, but it's not the time to panic. And the reason why is this shows you where the decline in revenues were. And what you see of that $2 billion decline, all of it, in fact, more than all of it, occurred in one category of revenue, so-called non-withheld income taxes. That's capital gains, it's income payments with returns. It's a lot of non-wage income that tends to be very volatile. And that's exactly where we expected revenues to fall after that boom in 21 and 22. That's where the bust usually occurs. And so when we saw that's where the revenues were falling, but sales tax continued to be relatively strong, withholding continued to be relatively strong, we didn't think it was time to panic. So that's kind of where we were leading into the current fiscal year. And the other thing that's important to keep in mind is because of this explosion in tax collections between 21 and 22, we are well ahead of pre-pandemic revenue trends. So what this slide shows you in the yellow bar is if there had been no pandemic and revenues had just grown consistently at 5%, which is a pretty healthy clip of revenue growth, the yellow bar shows what we would have collected. The blue bars are what we actually have collected. And what you'll see is starting in 21 and then really in 22, we are well above a pre-pandemic trend. And in 23, even after we lost $2 billion in tax collections, we're still $3 billion ahead of the pandemic trend. Now, on the one hand, that's good. It builds in a lot of cushion in the budget. The downside is, what if this means that for the next several years, we're going to kind of be returning to that long-term trend, right? That could mean a number of years of really anemic revenue growth. I think that's one of the questions that policymakers are struggling with right now.
Sure.
And so this is the budget that was signed into law by Governor Healy, her first budget signed into law. And the thing that I would just note for folks who are watching this is on the right-hand side, that 7% spending growth. That's one of the things that we're really mindful of and really concerned about heading into future fiscal years. I don't care what your revenue base is, you can't manage 7% year over year spending growth, right? No tax structure you're going to come up with is going to grow at that same rate. And so while we've had these kind of crazy years in the pandemic recovery where we saw big revenues and then spending kind of caught up, we really need to work hard to get revenues back in line with spending growth, because as we just saw, we are probably in a world of lower spending revenue growth going forward. And so those high levels of spending we've seen the last couple of years simply aren't sustainable. And then just the last fiscal slide, and then we'll move on to demographics. This is where we're at in the current fiscal year, so fiscal year 2024 to date. And there's kind of a good news, bad news story. Well, I'm not sure there's any good news, but there's okay news and bad news. So the bad news is we're $353 million below where we want to be based on this year's budget. That's the benchmark, right? The benchmark is kind of what the budget is built on. And these are relatively small. So being this far below this early in the year usually triggers some alarm bells for later in the year. The good news is we're still seeing moderate but positive nominal year over year revenue growth, right? We're collecting more than we did last year. That's a good thing. I think if that trend flips and we start collecting less than last year, I think people are going to get more and more concerned about where we're at fiscally.
And Doug, just a moment on this slide. So what causes, folks might not understand, what causes that kind of negative or
Sure.
falling behind?
Yeah, so this year there can kind of be two culprits. One is sometimes we're too aggressive with those benchmarks, right? Those benchmarks, the policymakers set them as part of the budget process. And sometimes they set them too aggressively, right? And so I think one of the things we talked about at the hearing this week is we ended fiscal year 2023 with less in tax revenue than we thought we would, and we've passed a major tax relief package. That may mean that the tax benchmark we built for 24 was too optimistic, right? So part of it can be the benchmark just needs to be adjusted. The other thing that I think we're seeing so far this year is that sales tax, which has been so strong the last couple of years, sales tax collections have totally flattened, right? So that could be because we're seeing inflation fall, but it's also probably because sales tax consumer spending was so high in the last few years that eventually that's going to kind of return to earth. That's another driver here.
Okay, thanks.
So now let's talk a little demographics and kind of where the state is and where we're going. And I'll start with some statewide info and then we'll go a little more local. So to me, this is the ball game right here for Massachusetts. This is the Massachusetts labor market looking over 10 years. So this is the labor force in Massachusetts, not just folks who are employed, but the theoretical labor force. Mm-hmm. And what you see here is that the numbers peaked before the pandemic. So we were already starting to see a drop in our labor force even before the pandemic. And so has the pandemic impacted all of these characteristics of the economy? Absolutely. but I think it is a mistake to think that the pandemic caused them or it's a pandemic blip, because you start to, if you take a further look at the data, you see we were seeing these trends even before March of 2020. And what you see here is since 2018, our labor force has fallen by 60,000 people, right? That's almost the size of the city of Framingham that's taken out of our labor force. That's a big impact. And if you look at the trends forward, it doesn't get better, right? So why is it happening? Well, here's one reason, right? The one way you grow your population is your birth rate. And the birth rate in Massachusetts is down about 25% just over the last 30 years, right? We're not talking about compared to the baby boom here. We're just talking about compared to the early 90s. We have about 25,000 fewer births a year than we did 30 years ago. That is going to be a demographic time bomb for Massachusetts that we're already starting to see the impacts of, right?
Yeah.
So historically, at least over the last 10 years or so, Massachusetts has been able to kind of overcome a lack of natural population growth with immigration, right? Both domestic and international immigration. And what this chart shows you, the blue bar is international migration to Massachusetts net. So this is people who move here, net of people who leave for other countries. And yellow is people who move to Massachusetts, net of people who move to other states, right? Domestic migration. And the story is kind of similar, right? That we have been a net loser in terms of domestic migration pretty consistently over the last 10 years, but that had been outweighed by the fact that we were bringing in a lot of international immigrants to the economy. And so if you look at 2014, for example, we were a gainer of about 30,000 folks or so. The concern here again is even before the pandemic. So let's look at 2019. There was about a canceling out of, we brought in 30,000 people internationally, lost 30,000 domestically. And then obviously the pandemic, we're now seeing domestic outmigration surpass international migration. So if we can't kind of reverse this trend, I think our long-term population forecasts are going to look more dire than they may have looked a couple of years ago.
And Doug, just on this side, so when you, in terms of the term migration, and the bodies that you're using here to count, that are making up these numbers, is this labor force or people?
This is people. So this is people. Okay. So as we think about 23, I think one thing we will see is, as we look at the influx of international migrants to Massachusetts over the last year, probably about 50,000 migrants related to kind of the ongoing migrant crisis.
Right.
I think you'll see that in these numbers. Now, obviously, aside from kind of system capacity issues and humanitarian issues associated with humanely kind of interacting with those families, a lot of them, most of them aren't legally able to work either. Right? So at least in the near term, it's not going to be a solution to kind of workforce challenges. But I will say, it's kind of ironic that in the long term, our biggest challenge is not enough people. And our biggest short-term challenge is we got too many people, right? So you'd think there's some way to kind of manage those two challenges consistently, but it's obviously a huge headache for I think everyone trying to figure that out right now.
And one more question. Oh, sorry, one more question on this slide. So to what extent do we attribute domestic migration because of the aging, population? So folks saying, what, I've had enough of kind of snow. I love Massachusetts, but I'm going elsewhere. Or for tax, certainly there's a tax part, et cetera.
So the reality is there's a number of factors here, right? And I think one of the frustrating things sometimes about the discourse on issues like this is people want to identify one thing. It's just taxes, or it's just housing, or it's just the pandemic. And you can be blessed with multiple challenges at the same time. And I think we are blessed with multiple challenges at the same time, right? Do I think that we will see an impact of the new income surtax on high wealth individuals who may be more likely to relocate? Yes, I do. Do I think that housing prices are driving out kind of younger professionals and people like that? Yes, I do. Right? Do I think that the pandemic has made it easier for people, especially in white collar jobs, to relocate? Yes, I do. Right? So there's a few different factors in here, and I think we're seeing the compilation of all of them.
Yeah, thank you.
So now let's look a little more locally. And again, I love doing this because it's always an interesting snapshot. And in this case, of a part of the state that, while I've been to several times, it's not where I'm from. So I'm kind of learning through this. And Shelby, you jump in because you'll know way more than I do. But I'll just start with a few things that may be interesting. And first, we'll start with population, right? And I found this one fascinating. So of the 5 communities we looked at, again, Framingham, Franklin, Northborough, Westborough, Worcester, you see, and here we're looking at population effectively in the decade prior to the pandemic, and then what we've seen since the pandemic. And it really is almost a mirror image, right? Prior to the pandemic, you saw the biggest population growth in Framingham and Franklin. Where have you seen the biggest population decline since the pandemic? Framingham and Franklin. Lowest population growth in the prior 10 years, Westborough, Worcester. Biggest population growth in the last few years, Westborough, Worcester, right? So I don't know this area incredibly well. My guess is, though, you're seeing some of the impact of different incentives related to commuting and work from home, housing prices, things like that, that has really benefited some communities in terms of that distribution of folks compared to prior to the pandemic.
Sure.
So now let's look quickly at the labor force. And here you're going to see a bit more of a microcosm of what the state sees as well. So this is those 5 communities. Let's just add it together, their labor force. And the labor force is the sum total of those employed and those unemployed. And again, you see this peak in 2019 or so and the decline since then. What that has meant for these 5 communities, and where I think that the real challenge comes in is, okay, so the number of employed folks has declined by, say, 5,000 people in the last 4 years. But note the number of has also declined, and on a percentage basis by a much larger share than actually employed. So it's not like you have this reservoir of untapped talent in terms of the unemployed labor market. You just don't have the labor force necessary to support the 170,000 people who were employed here in 2019. That's kind of the existential threat that we see, not just in Massachusetts, but you see it in this region as well. And then housing, obviously, that's the issue I think that's on everyone's mind these days.
Yeah.
So we're going to look at this a couple ways. And this, it really looks that we've done this in a number of different regions in the state. And it's striking no matter where I do it, but it's pretty consistent. This is homes for sale. We picked July 2017, 2019, 2023. And you just look at the absolute cratering of the number of homes for sale in every one of these communities, right? In Westborough, it's down, from, it's 1/5 of the number of homes that were for sale in 2017. That's pretty consistent. And what does this mean, right? One, it means that in spite of rising interest rates and things like that, you're continuing to see house prices go up because of the lack of supply, right? There just aren't a lot of homes out there. And you also, I think, do see this impact of people less willing to put their houses on the market because they're not sure they're going to be able to find another home, right? And so you have this bizarro scenario where even though you would think that housing prices might come down with higher interest rates as they needed to get people to be able to afford homes, you're just not seeing that. And I think this lack of supply is a big part of that.
Right. It'd be interesting to see how that how the work of the MBTA communities and all of that that movement starts to impact many of these communities that you're seeing here.
Absolutely. And that's a great transition to the next slide in terms of, a big part of this has got to be housing production, right? We need to build more. And so with this slide, a lot going on here, but I'll explain it quickly. So this is for each of those 5 communities, kind of when was their housing stock built, right? So let's look at Worcester. In Worcester, 45% of its housing stock was built prior to 1940, right? And that's pretty true, you would see, for a large kind of urban center with older buildings and things like that. A much more consistent story is probably what we're seeing in, say, a Franklin or a Northborough, right? Where we're seeing huge share of the housing stock built between, say, 1960 and 1999. And what we see a little differently in Westborough, where Westborough actually looks, I think, better than what we see in many communities, where Westborough does have more than 15% of its housing stock built in the last 20 years. That's not particularly common, right? You do see a large number of these communities where there was a huge boom in housing kind of between World War II and 1980 that has almost stopped since the mid-'80s. And one of the ways we need to, I think, get the housing market moving again is through additional production. Obviously, that's always a very complicated issue at the local level, but somehow we got to figure out how to get it done. So then transitioning from there to public finance, and we'll just look at this in the context of property taxes. So this is, again, these 5 communities. This is the average single family tax bill. So obviously different families, different people pay different taxes, but this is just the average. And what you see is among the 5 communities, Westborough is significantly the highest in terms of the nominal average single family tax bill, right? 20% or so above, say, Northborough.
Yep.
It's what you often see, though, is that the share of income paid, which is the yellow bar, doesn't necessarily correlate. So in many communities, so like take a Newburyport up in the North Shore, something like that, you might see a high nominal figure, but it's going to be a lower share of their income. Westborough actually kind of also punches a budget above its weight in terms of its share of income compared to, say, a Franklin or a Northborough or a Framingham. But it is worth noting that Worcester, even though their tax bills are less than half the size of Westborough, is actually, as on an income percentage basis, the highest of the 5 communities. So it's really kind of a question of how you look at this data.
Interesting.
And then let's talk education, because that's really kind of the future of the workforce. And this one was also really interesting to me. So in 2021, the state began to implement the Student Opportunity Act, which is a big reform on education policy in Massachusetts, right? And the vast majority of the new aid from that bill goes to communities that educate a lot of low income or English language learners. And so that's why, as we're looking at additional state aid, huge increase for Framingham, right? 50% growth in state aid in the last few years, 30% for Worcester. So what's Westborough doing up there with 43%? And that's because Westborough hasn't seen a big increase in its student population, which is typically the way you would get additional aid. What they have seen is an increasing share of low-income students in Westborough public schools, which has been a huge benefit to the school in terms of new state aid, right? Because of the way that formula works. Whereas a community like Franklin or Northborough, this is really one of the challenging issues that a lot of communities are dealing with that don't have population growth, don't have a significant share of low-income students. They're really not going to see much additional state aid the way the formula works. And I think Westborough has really benefited again from the fact that its share of low-income students has gone from a little over 10% to 20% in the last 4 years or so.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, that state aid is also driven by the numbers special education students as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, there were changes made in the formula related to special education too. Yes, although most of the direct like reimbursed special education funding actually comes through another aid program, but that's absolutely been a big cost driver recently as well.
Sure.
And then the other thing that can be interesting is to look at, well, how much do these districts actually spend per pupil on their K-12 system? Usually a little more diffuse than this. The 5 communities we looked at, it's a relatively tight bunch between, say, $18,000 and $20,000. What I thought was interesting was Northborough went from kind of well south of Westborough in 2013 to pretty significantly above Westborough beginning in 2019 or so. But Westborough's right in the middle of the pack, right? Where it's in that 19.5 range or so, in between both the urban areas as well as Franklin and Northborough.
Yeah, very interesting.
And then the last thing we like to end on, and then happy to talk through any questions, is this connection between education and the workforce. And what the Department of Education does here in Massachusetts is it surveys high school graduates every year about what they plan to do. And the options are 4-year college, 2-year college, work, or something else like the military or things like that. And the bluish bars here are Westborough, the yellowish bars are state average. And what I found interesting here is you see a little glimmer of these statewide trends in Westborough, but you also see some important differences. So we have seen a noticeable decline in the share of students planning to attend college in the state. You see a little bit in 4-year, big drop in 2-year for the state. In Westborough, there's a little different, right? Where you see that slight decline in 4-year, but it looks like those kids in Westborough are actually electing to go to 2-year college as opposed to go directly to work. A slight increase, I mean, more than doubling, but still only 2.5% of students in Westborough are going directly to work, whereas you've seen a big increase in the state total. Now let's think about what this looks like in an area with really growing population in Worcester, and you see, I think, what the implications of these kind of changing trends are for the state's work. So in Worcester, the percentage of kids going to 2-year college has declined by almost a third, right? Wow. And the percentage of students going directly to work has more than doubled. Now, what does this mean? On the one hand, it could be a good news story, right? Where we hear about worker shortages and workforce shortages. Well, maybe kids are responding to economic incentives and saying, you know what, I'm going to go directly into the workforce. I can make more money, and that's going to help ease our workforce shortages. And that's a positive thing. I think the negatives are twofold. One, keep in mind, we have a big higher education sector in Massachusetts. We already know we're going to have fewer kids. If of the kids who are remaining, fewer and fewer want to go to college, that's an economic concern for Massachusetts. And then 2, it's just about thinking about those jobs with a long-term path for economic prosperity. Is foregoing a 2-year or 4-year college at 18 it may be a good way to make more money when you're 19 to 25, but what does it mean for your career going forward? And that's one of the things that I think we don't know the answer to, and we're still trying to figure out.
Yeah, the federal legislation, right, that provides for, correct me if I'm wrong, aren't there incentives or here in Massachusetts for 2-year college, community college? So it'd be interesting to see how from a trending perspective, how that, what impact that has.
Absolutely. And I think that'll be fascinating. There's a lot of focus in Massachusetts about incentivizing 2-year colleges because I think they can be a huge engine to economic success. But we're doing it at a time when community college enrollment is really plummeting. And so the question is that a great investment to spur engagement in community college that otherwise might not happen? Or is it simply not reflecting the new economic reality, which is that's not where young people want to go, and we should be changing our attention elsewhere? And I don't think there's an answer to that. I think we just need,
Sure. The other thing that I've seen just is just this growth of online education, which wouldn't be reflected here, right? So what percent of students are learning online, creating skills, getting certificate programs, and then using that to go kind of right into a workspace. But very interesting.
Yeah, and so those are my slides. But
Yeah.
happy to take any questions or discuss anything you saw.
Well, so Doug, I don't have any questions, and unfortunately we're a little bit limited by time, but this has been really, really interesting. I hope that our viewers watch the slide, watch the show, watch it again, and would love to consider having you on kind of in the future as we kind of look back, because I think so much of this is, and this better than anyone, is really informed by kind of trend. It's like that balance, right, of trends and predictions, and how well are we doing. And I think what resonated with me during your first presentation and now today is that there's no one single thing that's driving the economy or impacting labor or just impacting taxes. So I do appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us and being a guest on today's show. Thanks so much.
Thank you, and love to be back.
Thanks. Okay, we'll return in just a moment for a conversation with our town assessor, John Steinberg. Hi, and welcome back to the 01581 Let's Talk. I'm joined by Jonathan Steinberg, our town assessor. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today.
Yeah, so wanted to talk with you about some recent activity that happened during the select board meeting. We had our tax classification hearing. It's great timing, and maybe ironic that we just had Doug Howgate on from the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation. So today is all about taxes, and who better to have on than our town assessor. So we voted, the select board voted to maintain a single tax rate, no differentiation between residential, commercial, industrial. And we also voted to not to approve some residential exemptions, and I'm totally blanking on the third one, John.
Small commercial exemption.
Thank you. So kind of status quo from that end. We had a great presentation. You presented to the board. For those who did not have a chance to see that, I'd encourage them to watch the meeting from November 28th. You can watch John's presentation in whole. And as always, information is on the town's website under the town assessor. So Jonathan, what's next? Now that we've set the classification or we've had that meeting, what's next?
So I'm proud to say that the actual tax rates is set by the assessor when I submit my documentation to the state Department of Revenue, and they approve it, and they approve financial data that we submit about the entire town, and that was approved on Monday. So the tax rate is officially set at $16.41 per thousand. And from here, we work on getting the tax bills put together and put out. And that involves those that have already applied for exemptions. We want to try to get those on the tax bills prior to the issuance of those, as well as a number of other facets to actually making that process happen. It can take a week or two before we even have that tax file set and sent out to our tax printer, who then we have to approve proofs and back and forth, and the tax bills will go out no later than December 31st.
Okay, great. Excellent. So that's good news on the tax rate. Taxes are, I love every time you come before the board, you say, spending is kind of a key element. So we have to kind of, now that we have the tax rate, we look forward to, the budget process. I know our town manager and all of our staff are well into that process, capital planning. And now we got to kind of figure out how we're going to manage our budget. and
Right.
effectively manage all the taxpayer dollars looking forward. So there's an abatement process, there's an exemption process. Can you tell us a little bit about, tell our viewers a little bit about timelines and deadlines they need to be aware of for that?
Sure, of course. Well, the values being set can be found on our website in our property database. And when the tax bills come out, there's an appeal time and what we call the abatement period. And you can file an appeal not based upon the dollar amount of your taxes. The average single family tax bill is going up $621. And not because your taxes are too high. If you come in, we'll tell you, we'll acknowledge that fact. We'll just say, how's your value? So you can appeal the value of your house. So it's important that you take a look at the records that we have online. And if you think our records are wrong, or there's some reason you couldn't sell your house for that amount, then you would come in and file for an abatement. The deadline for that is it must be postmarked or in our office by February 1st. I'm sorry to say that if you come in on February 2nd, statutorily, the board has no jurisdiction to act on that abatement filing, and that is sort of a hard deadline set by law.
And Jonathan, for those filing an abatement, what's the expectation as a taxpayer until that abatement is in process and approved or not, or declined?
Yeah, so you got to pay your tax bills. You know, if you incur any interest, it can impact that abatement and your right to an abatement by state law. The other thing I'll mention just about the values is the valuation for fiscal 24 is as of January 1st of 23.
Right.
So the value you would be appealing would not be based upon the house that sold up your street yesterday. It would be based upon sales of calendar 22. And so when you look at that, bear in mind that some of the sales are almost 2 years old at this point in time. Or if you bought your house recently and paid less than your assessment, that would be a fiscal 25 issue. And hopefully when we do our analysis, it will take your sale into account. So the expectation relative to your process is continue to pay your tax bill. We will try to act on it as quickly as possible. The board has 90 days from the date of receipt of application. And the process from there really is, we'll take a look at what you submit. You know, we want you to tell us why you think it's too high, not just that it's too high. We will help with that process. It is in no way, shape, or form adversarial. Okay, I want your values to be correct. I don't need to defend it for the sake of defending it. If there's an issue, we want to adjust it. Yeah. Some people fear that it's adversarial. They are concerned that what they're going to, we'll help you with the process. We have more data than you have relative to sales in 22. Sure. So just give us some insight and we'll work with you. I'll come out to the property myself personally, just to do an inspection and compare our data to what we have. And we'll do a full walkthrough. You know, that's sort of a caveat, is in order to really get a sense of what the property is and making sure our data is, you got to allow me into the house and let me walk through. You know, denying that can also impact the outcome of your abatement.
Okay. And this is obviously a confidential process between the homeowner and your office, and so and is handled as we know professionally. So for those that have questions, are concerned, I can't say enough about the awesome team. As you walk into the town hall to the left, they are there to answer questions small and large, and I've been the recipient of your services on a personal level, and you guys do a great job. So thank you to your entire staff.
Yeah, and I'll emphasize that it is confidential. Abatement applications are not part of public record, and we don't discuss your property or the fact that you filed an abatement with others. The other deadline I'll just mention is the exemption deadline. There are programs for people who are having a hard time paying their taxes, and that deadline is not until April 1st. So if you're curious about that information, it's on our website. You can come in and ask about it, and we'll help you with the process. There are financial income and asset requirements for certain ones. Veterans, if you're a disabled veteran, there are exemptions. So I encourage people to take a look at those.
Yeah, definitely. There are a number of them, and we recently adopted a senior tax exemption. Jonathan, can you tell our viewers a little bit about that?
Sure. It's a means-based exemption based upon the state income tax circuit breaker. So if you receive the circuit breaker in your calendar 22 taxes, then you can receive a match for that off your tax bill. So if you got, I think the maximum was just over $1,200. If you got that off your income taxes, you can then get that off your taxes, real estate taxes as well. And that is increasing next year by the recent legislation passed by the governor that will go up to $2,400. So it's some decent savings.
Yeah, absolutely.
If
Absolutely.
you don't know what I'm talking about, ask your accountant, because there are people who don't file tax returns who can actually get the state to cut them a check because they would qualify for the circuit breaker. So it's important to ask an accountant, ask at the senior center because they help with accounting if you're unsure about what that circuit breaker is.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Thank you for pointing that out, that we have services right at the senior center who will help with kind of taxes and filing, etc. So that's a great point. All right, excellent. Jonathan, thank you so much. Viewers, please go and check out the Town Assessor's page on the Westborough website, which is new and improved. We heard about that from our town manager a couple weeks ago. If you have any questions, call or stop into the office. Jonathan and his team are there to help. Jonathan, thank you so much. Wishing you a great end to your year, and thanks for all that you do.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, great. Thank you so much for joining into this episode of the 01581. I hope you found it interesting, and we've only got a couple more shows through the end of the year, and looking forward already to programming for 2024. So thanks. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and be well.